Today's event is the annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture, and it is entitled The Palestine Question and the American Public Sphere. It's safe to say that no one had done more to shed light on the Palestine question in the Western world than the late Professor Edward Said. He did this with remarkable intellect, a posh and polished command of the English language that rivaled any American-born Israeli ambassador or representative, and an unwavering lifetime commitment to the principles of justice and humanism. His passing left a tremendous void in the lives of his family, friends, and all those he knew. It's great to have greats Said with us today. But it also left a void in the effort for effective Palestinian advocacy in the United States. I'm honored to introduce our Edward Said Memorial Lecturer today, a Palestinian-American academic whose tireless work has contributed to filling the void Professor Said left behind. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received his BA from Yale in 1970 and his PhD from Oxford in 1974. He's the editor of the Journal for Palestine Studies and was past president of the Middle East Studies Association and advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli negotiations from October 1991 until June of 1993. He's the author of numerous books and scholarly articles on Palestine and the Middle East. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, Professor Rashid Khalidi.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and to those of you who are watching, thank you for viewing this talk. Those of you who live in Washington and who are subjected to the American media will probably be relieved to hear that I will not be talking about the peace process. If you insist, I'm happy to answer questions about it. I'm going to talk about a broader topic, which I think sheds light on why there is not a process that is leading towards peace. And this is the Palestine question and the American public sphere. It's a great honor to be doing this in the context of the Edward Said Lecture Series. Edward was a dear friend. I'm glad Grace is here. And I think that having a lecture series in his name will help to push the processes that he actually personally played, as Yusuf's introduction suggested, a very big role in opening up in this country. A number of factors played a part in cementing the support for Zionism and later for the State of Israel of its two primary international sponsors, Great Britain and the United States. As you know, each of them in its own era was the greatest power of its time. In winning over the British and the American political classes and their respective publics to the cause of Zionism and to the cause of Israel, a crucial role was played by scholarly and non-academic writings and later by the cinema and other media. I think it's insufficiently recognized that establishing the hegemony of Zionism in the field of ideas and in Anglo-American academic and public discourse was a vital precondition for its success in the political and diplomatic arenas. The discursive victories of Zionism preceded its triumphs in the chancelleries of the world and on the battlefields, and the latter would never have occurred, in my opinion, but for the former. In other words, in addition to being successful as an idea, as a national movement, and as a colonial settler phenomenon, political Zionism has always been a resounding public relations triumph. Now, the Zionist narrative was already almost uncontested in the United States even before 1948. My father and my mother, both of whom lived in New York in those years, tell me stories about how difficult it was to get out an alternative narrative. That Zionist narrative has become even more firmly entrenched in the public sphere in the decades since then, through extensive writings and through making major inroads into popular culture. The reason for this is not hard to understand. Historically, Zionist leaders, and after them leaders of the State of Israel, with good strategic sense and with a keen eye to opportunity and with a good story to tell, understood where to focus their efforts to garner international support, and the United States was a focus of this from a very early period. This was absolutely vital, they understood, to their efforts to create a Jewish state in what was then an Arab country. Overwhelming Arab majority. Arabs owned 94% of the land. It was an Arab country with a large Jewish minority. Not only to create a Jewish state in an Arab country, but also to create an impregnable position for it in a hostile region. Indeed, as they knew, it would have been impossible for them to have succeeded in their endeavor without massive external assistance, and therefore this work in the United States and in Britain and elsewhere was essential. What I'm going to discuss today mainly is how this Zionist and later Israeli narrative attained its preeminent status in this country. And then I'll conclude with a relatively brief assessment, unfortunately cursory because we only have about a half an hour or 35 minutes for the talk, of whether the power of this narrative may or may not be waning. For while for the better part of a century, this narrative was just as triumphant in the Western public sphere as were its Zionist and Israeli protagonists on the ground in Palestine. It has recently faced some challenges to its predominance, and I'll conclude by touching on some of those. I think it's worth noting that in some quarters, to even suggest that this narrative is preeminent or hegemonic is considered offensive, almost borderline anti-Semitic, while at the same time, any attempt to challenge its premises provokes fierce, sometimes vicious reactions. So you can't say that it's dominant, but if you challenge its dominance, heaven help you. So I think does any suggestion that this, and this is in fact a more important issue, so also does any suggestion that the Zionist movement in Israel were not or are not always and invariably underdogs and or victims. Challenging that premise is a very difficult thing to do. Zionist and Israeli history is rarely told by its proponents as the litany of almost unbroken successes and triumphs that is the real history of the modern Jewish national presence in Palestine. Instead, it's usually treated anyway, as an appendage to the wrenching narrative of Jewish victimhood over 2 millennia of European history, culminating in the tragedy of the Holocaust. Now, in the decades down to the 67 war, and in fact well after the 67 war, the tenor of most of what was written and said in the American public sphere about Palestine and about this conflict was almost entirely driven by Israeli concerns and attitudes. The views of critics of Israel received limited circulation, if they got any circulation at all, while Palestinian and Arab views, as far as I can tell, made no impact whatsoever in this country for decades. Much attention was lavished on the supposedly miraculous nature of the establishment of Israel in the wake of the Holocaust, in the face of Arab opposition, and in the face of what was described as the indifference or hostility of much of the rest of the world to its creation. Now, if you know anything about Israeli historiography, you'll know that this narrow focus mirrored exactly the Israeli narrative of a heroic anti-colonial struggle for self-determination against terrible odds and against, in particular, the callous and anti-Semitic British. Only recently, with the publication in this country of Tom Segev's One Palestine Complete, was it possible to find a comprehensive work by a trade publisher that you could actually find in a bookstore that shattered this myth and showed how the successes of Zionism depended entirely on British support for at least a couple of decades. In virtually all writings and media coverage before 1967, the Arabs were portrayed extremely negatively, with dark hints that they were driven by deep anti-Semitism and indeed were Nazi sympathizers, if not worse. There is a rich trove of literature in this vein that is being produced to this very day. You can go online, or you can go on Amazon, or you can go to your local bookshop and find a bunch of fairly recent works which recycle these ideas. The Palestinians, if they were mentioned at all, and the word Palestinian was a dirty word. You couldn't use it for several decades in polite company. The Palestinians, if they were mentioned at all, were described as murderous and irrational enemies of the Jews and as having left their homeland in 1948 at the behest of their leaders, the better to enable the superior Arab invading armies to wipe out the fledgling Jewish state. These myths were central to the Zionist narrative, and they were hammered home relentlessly via every possible medium. This was done so effectively that these core Zionist myths came to be nearly universally believed in this country. By contrast, the general picture of Israelis in the American public sphere was highly positive. Glossy coffee table books and more serious books carried photos of handsome young men and buxom young women in shorts, busy making the desert bloom. There were no ugly people in Israel for the first 2 decades, if you believe the films and the books that you saw. Much was made. There were no dark people in Israel either. They were all very light complexioned. Much was made of the achievements of the new Israeli state in integrating immigrants, in building a strong economy, and in fashioning democratic state institutions. By contrast, little attention was paid to the continued sustained support that Israel received from the great powers throughout its existence, or to the colonial nature of Zionism as it related to the Arab majority of Palestine before 1948. Even less attention was paid after 48 to what happened to the Palestinians who had been forced to flee in that year, or to those who were left behind in Israel as Arabs, as citizens of the Israeli state, living under military rule, under a comprehensive system of surveillance and control until 1966. The iconic work of the first decades after 1948 was not a scholarly one. It was rather a thoroughly mediocre but incredibly influential novel by a man named Leon Uris, entitled Exodus, a Novel of Israel, whose sales equaled those of the highest-selling novel in American history up to that point, Gone with the Wind. Together with the Academy Award-winning 1960 motion picture of the same name with the handsome young Paul Newman as Ari Ben Canaan, this book probably did more to disseminate these and other fanciful and ahistorical myths than did all English-language publications up to that point combined, and I would argue all English-language publications perhaps up to this point. Now, I think it's worth noting that this book was not the unaided fruit of the loins, as it were, the intellectual loins, as it were, of Leon Uris. He wrote it, of course. But the book was commissioned by a renowned public relations professional, a man who is in fact considered by some to be the founder of public relations in the United States, a fellow by the name of Edward Gottlieb, who desired to improve Israel's image and who chose Uris to write the novel after his successful first novel on World War II and secured the funding which paid for Uris's research and trip to Israel. Given that many of the basic ideas about Palestine and Israel held by generations of Americans find their origin either in this trite novel or the equally cliched movie, Gottlieb's inspiration to send Leon Uris to Israel may have constituted one of the greatest advertising triumphs of the 20th century. The man deserves his place in the public relations pantheon. Needless to say, on every crucial point, the account purveyed in the mainstream media, in Exodus, and in academic literature was totally at odds with the historical record. As a very few lonely Palestinian and Western scholars pointed out in articles that were ignored in this country and elsewhere in the late 50s and the early 1960s. Among the main points in dispute was Israel's responsibility for the expulsion of about 750,000 Palestinians, the majority of the country's Arab population, from most of Palestine, the parts that became the State of Israel, and the true nature of the 1948 war. A huge edifice of scholarship, pseudo-scholarship, and rank propaganda was devoted to obscuring the realities of the dispossession of the Palestinians and to showing that the Arabs, supposedly much stronger than the Jews in Palestine, had both the intention and the capability to strangle the infant Israeli state at birth. Much of what has appeared since then in the American public sphere repeats these unfounded assertions, which, again, precisely mirror the founding myths of the Israeli state. It wasn't really until 4 decades after 1948 that the narrative that a few people had tried to put forth in the early 50s was thoroughly substantiated. The counter-narrative that a few people had put forward in the early 50s and 60s was thoroughly substantiated by research by the so-called Israeli new historians based on newly released documents from the Israel State Archives. Nothing in this litany of myth and distortion, in fact, was true. In the interim, much had been done to cement the mythology popularized by Exodus in the American public mind. During the 60s, moreover, there were important changes in the self-image of the American Jewish community and in American attitudes towards Israel. As the distinguished historian Peter Novick, who was my colleague at Chicago, showed in his brilliant book, The Holocaust and American Life, several factors increased the attachment to Israel of the American Jewish community during this period before 1967. One of them was the heightened prominence given to the Holocaust, which came to be seen as a central figure and is today still a central feature in American Jewish identity. Additionally, the 1967 war had a galvanizing effect on American Jewish attachment to Israel. It connected a whole generation that was coming of age at that time with Israel in a way that was different to what had come before. In part, this was a function of a new myth, which connected with increased awareness of the Holocaust. This myth was that on the eve of the June War, you're all familiar with this, faced with the possibility of another Holocaust at the hands, Israel was faced with the possibility of another Holocaust at the hands of the massed Arab armies. Among generations of Americans who reached maturity from that time, like myself, until now, this myth has achieved a near sacrosanct status. Most people believe this is true. This is the case, although all serious scholarship has shown that notwithstanding the very grave fears that both the Israeli public and the American Jewish community had, American and Israeli intelligence analysts, military and civilian, unanimously concurred that Israel would crush the Arab armies whether or not Israel attacked first. There is no analyst who disagreed with that at the time. We now know because the historical record is available, and that is an established fact. But these myths and the fears around them were brilliantly and ceaselessly exploited from then onwards in order to cement sympathy for Israel. The growing emphasis on the Holocaust and the increased identification with Israel have grown into what have now been institutionalized as central pillars of American Jewish identity in ways that were not true previously. Talk to very old people among you and ask them what was New York like in the 1940s. Not many people remember it. I was born in 48, so I certainly don't remember it. But I remember my parents telling me there were a lot of anti-Zionists. The New York Times was run by people who were anti-Zionist. You could go on and on and on in seeing a range of opinion in the American Jewish community which ceased to be there by the 60s or 70s. American Jewish identity has become much more focused on Israel than it ever was before, at a time when overt discrimination in the United States against Jews was declining. In the 60s, there were racial covenants in this city which prevented Jews from buying homes. Now, young people don't believe that I'm the truth of this, but anybody older than 50 or 60 knows that that's true. These things are gone. They've disappeared. And as a result of this and many other things, there was a much greater degree of communal self-confidence and assertiveness in this community. These shifts in the views of several generations of American Jews who came to maturity before and after 67 were mirrored by an important transformation in how American public opinion, or at least segments of it, came to view Israel. And that's what I want to talk about now. These were changes that were a result of the fact that our government, the U.S. government, was increasingly coming to see Israel for the first time as an ally, because it was seeing it for the first time again as a proxy in the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union and with its Arab clients in the region. This was not always the case. We think it was, but it wasn't. The United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side in 1947-48. They both supported the establishment of Israel. They were on the same side in 1956. They both opposed the tripartite aggression against Egypt. There was no Cold War alignment on one side and another of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel had not been considered to be a strategic asset to the United States by most American policymakers from 1947 right up through the mid-1960s. But by 1967, the United States had become completely aligned with Israel against the Arab states, most of which were supported by the USSR, in a configuration that in fact continued until the end of the Cold War. Israel has been considered a strategic asset ever since, but I'm trying to stress never was before that, even though it may be that there's currently some questioning of Israel's strategic value in some policymaking circles in this town today. I'll talk about that maybe in questions. Now, this was a shift, this alignment, this Cold War alignment with Israel, that was a long time in coming. And there are a number of points that you could choose as the tipping points. President Kennedy's delivery of the first U.S. military equipment directly to Israel in the early 60s, President Johnson's increasing alienation from Egypt, beginning not with the Arab-Israeli conflict, but beginning with the Yemen War and with American opposition to Egyptian involvement in the civil war in Yemen, starting in 1962. And finally, President Johnson's deep and abiding sympathy for Israel. This was derived partly from Johnson's long-standing, close, and in some cases intimate friendships with many major donors to the Democratic Party who were fervently pro-Israel. The impact of the Vietnam War was also a big factor in causing policymakers to see the Middle East in Cold War terms much starker than had been the case before. And the June War itself played a role in this closer American alignment with Israel. This resounding Israeli victory showed American policymakers who were deeply shaken at this time by Vietnam. Johnson was about to resign a year later because of Vietnam. This is before the Tet Offensive, but things were already going badly. It showed him and the people around him that Israel could serve American interests in opposing the Soviet Union. The defeat of the Soviet-supplied Arab armies provided a welcome triumph for the free world at a time when news from the Southeast Asian battlefields was bad. In the wake of this, American public opinion tended to follow the policymakers in looking at the Middle East. In general, there was a further demonization of the Arabs, and especially of the Palestinians and the PLO. The dominant narrative emphasized their alignment with the Soviet Union in the Cold War and their terrorist proclivities. These tropes have persisted in the rhetoric of our government, and especially in the rhetoric of our Congress ever since, and in fact are embedded in much of the media to this day. This continued to the end of the Cold War. After that, of course, the definition of terrorism was slightly modified to reflect the end of the evil empire, but the focus on Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim terrorism has remained a constant until the present day. Now, this was the situation until the end of the Cold War, and a little afterwards, I would say. In recent decades, I would argue there have been some positive changes in the way the Palestine question has been perceived. The growth of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in the 60s, or the rebirth of this movement in the 60s, had an impact on a number of people. Although this movement was tarred by its opponents with the brush of terrorism, the human face of the Palestinians, which had previously been almost totally obscured, could be discerned for the first time in the American media, starting in the 70s and the 80s. Events in the Middle East, in my view, played a crucial role in this evolution. Notable among them was the 10-week Israeli siege and bombardment of Beirut in 1982, which killed 17,000 people, most of them civilians, and which shocked even Israel's staunch supporter, Ronald Reagan. You can go to the presidential archives in Simi Valley, as some of my students have done, and see some quite remarkable reactions on the part of one of the most pro-American, pro-Israeli administrations in history to what Israel was doing in Lebanon. Even more shocking to them were the Sabra and Shatila massacres. All of this, of course, was heavily covered by the U.S. media. I would argue that the 1982 roll was a seminal event and played a crucial role in changing American views of who was David and who was Goliath in the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians. The next stage in this evolution was the first Palestinian Intifada, which started in December 1987, and which strongly reinforced, because of the way in which it was covered, partly, this new sense in American public opinion of the Palestinians rather than the Israelis as underdogs. And if you look at the Israeli media, and if you look at the way in which the pro-Israel advocacy establishment in this country reacted to these events, you could sense an enormous frustration on their part. Stuff that they'd been able to get away with for decades suddenly wasn't flying, and a different narrative was being purveyed by the very same journalists who just more or less repeated whatever they wanted them to say, out of Beirut or elsewhere, or out of West Bank villages where Israeli soldiers were beating up Palestinian kids. The Madrid-Oslo peace process, abortive though it was, in my view, which saw the PLO engaged in negotiations with Israel, furthered this process of humanizing the previously despised Palestinians. I would argue that a lot of this progress was undone by the impact of the Second Intifada beginning in 2000 in 2000, especially by the suicide bombings that began a couple of years later against Israeli civilian targets. These events shocked Americans who were deeply affected in the wake of 9/11 by attacks on this city and on New York. And I think that the suicide bombings in Palestine, inside Israel rather, reestablished the perception of Palestinians as irrationally violent and hate-filled, and of Israelis as innocent victims and nothing else. Nevertheless, I would argue that in spite of these ups and downs, the space had already been opened up for more nuanced and balanced views of the conflict and of Palestinian and Israeli topics generally. The very term Palestine, which was once considered taboo by mainstream publishers, such was the success of the relentless Zionist and later Israeli effort to replace Palestine with Israel. Use of this term was now more acceptable and less controversial than had been the case previously. The result of this broad shift was the publication, really for the first time, of works in the mainstream trade press, of books that enabled Americans for the first time to have access to versions of Middle East realities which reflected a variety of conflicting perspectives, contrasting perspectives rather, not just the same old pro-Israeli slant. I would argue that an important role in this process, certainly in academia but also outside, was played by the publication of Israel's new historians and also by the writing of a whole slew of iconoclastic Israeli scholars, Ami Ayalon, the late Baruch Kimmerling, Menachem Klein, Shaul Mishal, Avram Sela, Gabi Peterberg, the late Tanya Reinhardt, Shlomo Zand, Gershon Shafir, Zev Sternhell, Edith Zertal, Yael Zerubbabel. I could actually go on for half an hour with the names of Israeli scholars published in English, easily accessible, whose writings showed that the one-dimensional perspective offered by the Israeli state and its American apologists was much more impoverished than the broad range of views available within Israeli society itself. These were, in many cases, the most respected figures in Israeli academic life. Now, many other books published on aspects of the Palestine question recently have broadened the range of what's available. There's been an increased willingness on the part of trade publishers in particular, whose main concern is understandably sales and profit, and who shy away from certain kinds of acrid controversy, to consider publishing works that would previously have been considered too provocative to sell well. A reticence on this score, plus the blatant biases in favor of Israel of many people in the publishing industry, were always adduced as the reason that mainstream publishers would not touch works that presented another version of reality than the one emanating from a pro-Israeli perspective. But recently, President Carter's book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, and John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt's book on the Israeli lobby have been major publishing successes. The publishers actually made money on these books, made a considerable amount of money on these books. They showed, as have a few other books, that it is possible to publish profitably works critical of the received pro-Israeli version of events. To this, in terms of the important elements in this change, I think, must be added the changing situation on U.S. campuses, where the situation of Palestine is concerned. Now, I went to university in this country. I was an undergraduate in this country, and I remember how difficult it was to say anything on campus in those days, where I went to school and other places. My brother was at Columbia, I was at Yale. I visited other campuses. It was very hard in those days, and it wasn't much easier in the 80s when I came back from Lebanon. But things are beginning to change, especially in the past decade. This was already clear to key figures in the Israel advocacy establishment as early as 2002, when the Jewish Telegraphic Agency published a remarkable article entitled, I'm quoting here, "Jewish Groups Coordinate Efforts to Help Students," in quotes, "take back campus." Now think about this headline, 2002. This article, and a slew of other articles at the time, indicated that these groups already felt in 2002 that U.S. campuses had been lost to them and had been won over to Palestinian advocacy. A growing disenchantment, and there was reason for them to feel this way, I think. Maybe not to the same extreme degree that they were suggesting in this alarmist article, but something was changing. A growing disenchantment among liberal young American Jews, especially college students, was, if you noticed it, the main burden of a remarkable article by Peter Beinart in the June 10th issue of the New York Review of Books earlier this year. And you can go into this, and he produces actually some really interesting data produced by Fred Luntz. You know who Fred Luntz is. This is Washington. Produced by Fred Luntz for exactly the same people who are described in this article. Because they were afraid they were losing the campus in their terms, they commissioned Luntz. What's going on among young American Jews? And the results are an extraordinary set of data, which are the basis of at least one element in the Beinart article. Now, I think the stress on the decline of support for Israel in the American Jewish community more broadly, and on campus in particular, may be a little exaggerated. But I do think something appears to be changing when you compare things to the way they were a few decades ago, in the 60s or in the 80s, when I can tell you they were quite different. Many factors are at work here. I can't go into this in any length. The Journal of Palestine Studies, which I edit, is actually about to publish an article which goes into some of the ways in which new media have an impact on this. It'll probably be not in this coming issue, the issue after that. I'm not sure. But I suggest you all look it up when it's published. Many factors are at work here, notably the access of alternative information and views via the internet, which enables young people, all of whom seem to be extremely technically savvy, to compile their own view of the world. In doing this, they often rely on sources closer to events than the mainstream media, blogs, YouTube, newspapers, satellite TV stations in the Middle East, publishing in English or in other languages, and all kinds of sources of information which we simply didn't have in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. In the face of this changing landscape, the Israel advocacy establishment has mounted a number of initiatives all over the landscape, but especially on U.S. campuses. These have included redoubling efforts to positively brand Israel for public opinion generally, but especially for college students. They've included extraordinarily expensive programs to send even more young people to Israel on what I call magical mystery propaganda tours, but call them what you want, Hasbara tours, whatever. They include the establishment of literally scores of Israel studies programs and chairs on U.S. campuses. At the same time, there's been an increase in attempts to exert external pressure on American universities. This involves the mobilization of the media, the mobilization of politicians, the mobilization of off-campus organizations, and sometimes the mobilization of a few outspoken alumni. At many universities, these pressures have thus far been successfully resisted. But at other universities, administrators have caved in when confronted with the attack dog methods of their critics. The record shows that administrators will often not stand up to such powerful outside forces on their own and will only feel obliged to do so if faculty and students insist on academic freedom, insist on faculty responsibility for curriculum and for the promotion and tenure processes, and insist on the insulation of the university from insidious external influences, especially from politicians and the media and outside groups. Now, let me conclude. I began by suggesting that the realm of ideas was a major battlefield for those who were seeking to establish the Zionist project in Palestine at the expense of its indigenous inhabitants. And I went on to suggest that success in this endeavor was crucial to the success of the project. I don't know whether, as a result of the new diversity of opinion that I think is out there in academia, in the media, and in the public space, but not in the political realm at all, it's too early to tell whether there will be a rapid lessening of the intellectual and with it the political hegemony of a particular Zionist perspective, which has been sustained for most of the 20th century. Certainly, the growing availability of new interpretations than were once available, of new narratives, of alternative of ways of seeing things, mean that Americans can begin to make up their own minds. Something that wasn't possible when they were restricted to one tendentious, stridently pro-Israel interpretation of facts, as was the case until the recent past. I think there's reason for deep short-term pessimism about the outcome of the political process that determines American Middle East policy, which is why I haven't talked about it. There is reason for deep short-term pessimism about the situation in Palestine and the situation in Israel. Both are endlessly depressing. But there are signs, I think, of encouraging positive longer-term trends in the public sphere in this country. This is not a situation that will change rapidly, however. It took generations and a lot of hard work to establish the myths Israel was built on. And it will take years and a lot of hard work to deconstruct them, and for the generations that are not going to change their minds in many cases to lose their influence. This is a matter partly of time and partly of hard work. I think it'll be a long time before the political situation certainly will change, such that we can expect an end to Israeli impunity. Israel will continue to be protected in pretty much anything it chooses to do by our Congress and by our government. But I think the handwriting may be on the wall. I think that the system of domination and control through the calculated, dosed use of violence and overwhelming power that has obtained in the occupied territories for over 43 years, a system based entirely on violence, and that has maintained the dispossession of the Palestinian people for 62 years, cannot be hidden forever. Maybe it can't be stopped, but it can't be concealed, is my point. The brilliantly conceived discursive artifice, a citadel of lies, that has concealed this system of power and control for so long is actually beginning to crumble. Given the acknowledgement, not by people in the Palestine Center or isolated American academics, given the acknowledgement by Israeli leaders, such as former prime ministers Barak and Olmert, that continuation of the status quo, continuation of the occupation, continuation of settlements, which is happening and will continue to happen, I would argue, for the foreseeable future, will inevitably lead to apartheid and worse. The day is clearly coming when this status quo will pass. Maybe a long time for that day to come, but it is, I think, coming. It is up to Israelis and Palestinians in the first instance to dismantle this iniquitous system, this unjust system, this unsustainable system, and to put in place one that is more just. But the last thing I want to say is, while it's essentially up to them there, it's also up to us here. Americans bear a very, very, very heavy responsibility in this matter. We are the 900-pound gorilla on the Middle Eastern stage. The United States has upheld this entire discriminatory, unjust structure ever since 1948, ever since the partition resolution of 1947. Clearly, a beginning in a new direction, at least in the public sphere in this country, has begun. I would strongly argue that true peace with justice in Palestine for both peoples that live there depends on the continuation of this process in this country. Thank you very much.
Why don't we start right over here?
Come up here.
Professor Khalidi, a quick look at the map today of the West Bank and Palestine shows...
I can hear him. Yeah, keep talking.
Okay, so the reality in the West Bank and Palestine shows that the one-state solution is becoming a reality on the ground rather than alternative solution. To what extent do you think that this one-state solution is gaining support here in the United States among Palestinians and also Americans?
You know, I wish people would talk about changing the state of things in Palestine rather than talking about what I describe as how many states can dance on the head of a pin. There is no one-state solution, and there's no two-state solution in the foreseeable future. There is the status quo, and that's what we're going to have. We have one state. We have one Israeli state between the river and the sea. That's the only sovereign authority that's going to be there for a very long time. In my view, there's nothing that indicates that Israel or the United States is prepared to allow a sovereign, independent Palestinian entity to come into being. It's not just because of the changes on the ground. It's because of very clear positions, most recently by this administration, whereby it's decided to hand over the Jordan River Valley to Israel. I mean, how can you have a Palestinian state without a Jordan River Valley, without Jerusalem, without this, without that? So the premise of your question, I don't disagree with. I don't see a two-state solution in the foreseeable future. But my late friend Tony Judt once said, may he rest in peace, what one politician has done, another politician can undo. There's no reality that's permanent. None of these things are necessarily permanent. I simply see absolutely nothing that's going to change that dynamic. So I don't really think it's very useful to talk about one state or two states at this point. It's interesting, I think, to talk about how do we change this dynamic, especially in this country, which sustains and funds and finances privately and publicly what's happening there, which arms both sides, all sides of every conflict in the Middle East. We profit, as do many other people, from the continuation of the status quo. That's what we should be focusing on. How do we change that situation? Now, whether that leads to an end of the occupation and an end of settlement and one kind of solution or another kind of solution, we should have our eyes on some kind of justice, some kind of end of discrimination, self-determination for everybody, and protection of everybody's rights. And we should focus on changing the status quo. But frankly, if you're interested in what you're going to see in the next 10 or I don't know how many years, you're going to see a continuation of the status quo, a one-state solution, which I certainly don't think most people, when they talk about one-state solution, are particularly happy with. So that's my response to any question about the one-state and the two-state solution.
I was wondering if you think the emergence of J Street is significant in terms of changing what it means to be pro-Israeli in America, or for any other reason.
Mm-hmm. I think that there are a number. Yeah, the question was, do I think that the emergence of J Street has changed what it means to be pro-Israeli in America? J Street is a new lobby that claims to be pro-Israel and pro-peace, and which is, I think, self-described as, or is described by many as an alternative to AIPAC. I think the emergence of J Street and the emergence of a number of other groups and the emergence of people who are out there speaking and writing and playing, M.J. Rosenberg, I could name a dozen people, Mondo Weiss, Philip Weiss, and Adam Horowitz. There's dozens of people out there with a considerable public presence, is evidence of the change that the Beinart article talked about, that I've talked about, and that anybody with a brain to see or has come on a U.S. college campus can tell you is underway. Not just in the Jewish community, throughout important segments of American society. There are other segments that are completely unaffected by this. There are parts of the United States, there are parts of the evangelical community, there are very important segments, especially the older segments of various communities, the Jewish community and others, who are not going to change. They're not changing, they're not going to change. And they're people who vote, they're people who have influence. So that doesn't mean that everything is changing. But at a certain level, I think what J Street represents, I'm not talking about the specific positions it takes, is something that indicates that there is a change. You wouldn't have seen something like this 30 or even 20 years ago.
Of course, I agree with you when you say that the intellectual basis of Israeli political dominance in this country are very important to come to terms with. Mm-hmm. But I'm worried that this means that whatever happens on the ground is not as important in shaping whether or not this Israeli political dominance continues. In other words,
yeah, I see your point.
As things on the ground look like it's going to be apartheid and continue to deteriorate, wouldn't this also lead to a change in the position of Israeli political dominance? Or is it that Americans don't read, don't know, don't want to know, and therefore it's not important?
I would actually say that the changes on the ground have been an important factor in changing views in this country among the people I'm talking about. I mean, I talk to students all the time, and a lot of them go there. And many of them go on these magical mystery tours, or they go for their cousin's bar mitzvah, or they go for whatever reason they go, religious tourism, Christian or Jewish kids. And some of them come back with their views reinforced, and those are, that's fine. But a lot of them are actually seeing the reality that you're talking about, what the structure of dominance and control and this controlled use of violence actually means. And it's something that Israelis, most of them don't see. Only the ones who serve in the occupied territories ever see it. Most Israelis don't see it. They don't want to see it. They're insulated from it. It's 2 minutes away from them, but it's a universe away. I don't think a lot of people in a lot of American cities see what happens in a lot of American neighborhoods either. This is not unique to Israelis, by the way. In any case, this has, I think, had an enormous effect. I know a lot of people who have gone there, and they've just been shaken. Academics, ordinary tourists, students who go on these tours, students who go with their families. I actually think that this is an unsustainable, unsupportable, unspeakable system, and anybody who sees it realizes that. Now, I'm not sure if you're suggesting that the fact that most Americans don't know about it means that it continued. Yes, that's true, but the point is, it's harder and harder to defend it where you can actually get to discussion of that. where there are not red herrings dragged in about, the Palestinians' terrorist proclivities or whatever nonsense is raised, to obscure this constant, systematic, controlled application of violence to keep another people subjugated, which is what's been going on since the ethnic cleansing and the dispossession of 1948. And that's a system that's very hard. The fact that it's been obscured and occluded for decades, I mean, this is genius. The people who did this have done an amazing job. It's very hard to do that over decades, over generations. My point is people are seeing through that. Lots more people are beginning to see through that.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I think it is really unfair to say that the Palestinians did not have support in this country. Like you, I went to undergraduate and graduate school in the aftermath of 1967. There was a great deal of support and a great deal of goodwill. I think it was squandered by an inept, incompetent, duplicitous, if you will, Palestinian leadership. I mean, I remember when Berkeley City Council, University, everybody went out on the streets and supported the Palestinians in 1970 and thereafter. I mean, I spent 7 years going to college in this country. There was not a month that went by without some sort of support for the Palestinians. And I think it is unfair to deny that. I think the Palestinians have failed to project the kind of international paradigm to reach out to the causes and the movements that were present in this country. Thank you.
I would agree to some extent with the first part of what you said, and I would certainly agree fully with the second part of what you said. But I think that what was happening in the People's Republic of Berkeley was not representative even of most American university towns, let alone most American cities. I actually don't think we had a whole hell of a lot of support in the 60s and 70s for the Palestine issue. There was a little bit, but I would then agree with you that it was squandered. There is not an Arab leadership. There was not and is not a Palestinian leadership, and there was not and is not an Arab leadership that has any idea of how to deal with this issue. As far as most Arab governments are concerned, they're much more concerned with staying in power at the expense of their people and the Palestinians than anything else, and of maintaining their exceedingly good relations with Washington in order to do so, than they are with the Palestine cause. And this is particularly the case because almost none of them depend on none of them have democratic legitimacy, with the exception of a couple of governments that really have to worry about their public opinion. And in many cases are utterly dependent on external support for their survival. So even in those cases where there are Arab diplomats or Arab intellectuals who could make arguments, the situation, the miserable situation in the Arab world just is not conducive to that. And I couldn't agree more with you about Palestinian leaderships. There is yet to be a Palestinian leader, with the exception perhaps of the late Shafi al-Hout. There are one or two who actually had some sense of what you had to do to appeal in the United States, or of the importance of it. Whereas there wasn't a Zionist leader who ever failed to understand the importance of this since Herzl. Every one of them, they understood the importance of the situation on the ground, they understood the importance of military, demographic, economic things, but they also understood the importance of external support, in particular in this country and before it in Great Britain. And we have never had anybody, certainly not since 1948, who is clear on the Palestinian side, who's clearly understood that. I agree with you.
Hi, Professor Khalidi. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, former director of Jewish Voice for Peace and B'Tselem's U.S. office here. I'm kind of following up on the last question. Last week at the Palestine Center, I sent a question to Naja Hijab asking if there is some alternative strategy. As an American Jew working on this issue, I'm keenly aware that it's very, very difficult to counter this long-term narrative that you're talking about without having a Palestinian leadership that is going to appeal to Americans. Now, right. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing it, but it's not, but there's also nothing I, as an American Jew, can do about that. So my question for you is, do you see either a Palestinian leadership over there or some broad-based national strategy that can compete with the current Fatah or Hamas models emerging anytime in the foreseeable future?
The short answer is no. The Palestinian national movement is in its worst state since the 1948 war. It is led by two movements, both of which, incidentally, including Hamas, are fully and utterly committed to a two-state solution, which I've just tried to argue is just not in the cards, and which are much more concerned with fighting each other and maintaining external support than they are with the interests of their people. And if you know how to read polling, you can see that they're both very unpopular. If you took away the patronage that they so lavishly are able to distribute to their supporters, they probably would have very little support. But they have powerful electoral machines, and they're going to be the political forces in place for a little while at least. Having said that, I have to say that I think that in Palestinian civil society, there resides a source of great strength, if not yet a strategy, a couple of things that have to be looked at. First of all, Palestinian society has not shattered under the hammer blows that it suffered since 1948. It's still there. It's still resilient. You don't see beggars in the street. You don't see total social dysfunction, even in situations of great stress, like inside East Jerusalem, like in the refugee camps in Lebanon, like in the Gaza Strip. Secondly, the Palestinian economy, notwithstanding the tortuous restrictions on it as a result of the occupation, actually is surviving. It's partly surviving because of this external money, most of which is not being put to very good uses. But it is mainly surviving thanks to the entrepreneurship and the resilience of small individual Palestinian business people. And those are two very important facts to remember when you think about the situation. This society hasn't been shattered, and people are managing in spite of everything. Moreover, you see in society, not yet reflected at the political level, a rejection of both most of what Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is saying and most of what Hamas is saying. Most people do not want an Islamic State, and most people do not think that what Hamas does can lead to liberation. So the firing of rockets, most of which land on the heads of the people of Gaza and which bring a 100-to-1 kill ratio, that's not liberated anything. Hamas won't agree with what I say, but that's true. And negotiations, which take us back before where we were in 1991, when we had letters of assurances from the U.S. government, which no Palestinian leadership since then has had the good sense to say, yo, give us what you promised us in 1991 in a letter of assurances, and we'll be happy. Give it to us in terms of settlements. I mean, you have a level of incompetence in the negotiating process, which is mind-boggling, and people can see that. There's no support for that, and there's no support for the alternative. That being the case, I think you're beginning to have an understanding that some nonviolent forms of resistance, some nonviolent forms of protest have some possibilities. I think you're beginning to see an understanding that you can't depend on these leaders, or for that matter, heaven help us, the Arab countries, to solve this problem. We're not yet at the point where civil society reaches out to this country, is able to organize itself. I think some of the BDS movement, some of the connections with these flotillas to Gaza indicate and some of the connections between the occupied territories and between Palestinians outside at a people-to-people level, between kids in camps in Gaza and kids in camps in the West Bank, say, the West Bank and Lebanon, or Jordan and Gaza. Indicate the building of links that might be the basis for something emerging from civil society. But is something there now? No. The answer to your question, unfortunately, is no.
Professor Khalidi, how do you interpret the fact that there seems to be more discussion about Israel's nuclear program and its nuclear weapons? The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency was recently in Israel and apparently called on the Israelis to join the non-proliferation treaty, be open to inspections. Rose Gottemuller from the State Department has said on a couple of occasions, including in an earlier academic paper, that Israel should join this treaty. Also, Israel's joining the NPT, or being open to inspections as part of the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. So how do you view this in the context of
that's a great question.
What's going on?
Well, let's start from the fact the United States made sure that the resolution that would have enjoined Israel to join the NPT was voted down in Geneva, I believe it was. In any case, I think that the reason that there's been some change in tone on this is that even before the election and since the election, the president has actually mentioned Israel's nuclear capabilities in a discreet way, in ways that indicate that he understands that there actually is a link between American concerns about Iranian nuclear capacities and this massive nuclear arsenal, which everybody knows about. The emperor is, well-dressed, and we pretend he's naked. Give me a break. he understands that there's a link between these things. It would take someone of truly moronic intellectual stature not to realize it. But, Congress goes on and talks about it as if, Iran is here and Israel is there and never the twain shall meet. So I think that's one of the motivations for it. Another is that a lot of people are concerned about Iran's potential nuclear capacities, military capacities in the region, not just Israel. And those countries would really like to see Israel's nuclear weapons brought into some kind of regime as one of the elements in a structure that might help to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and prevent them from being forced to develop nuclear weapons themselves. I would guess that this is a Saudi, an Egyptian, and a Turkish motivation. All of these countries would probably really rather not see Iran have nuclear weapons, but really like to see Israel's nuclear weapons limited too. So that's, I think, another motivation, especially as this nuclear issue becomes the Iranian nuclear issue becomes more and more critical, as more and more hysteria is whipped up in this country about it and in Israel. These countries, I think, have a stronger and stronger motivation to put pressure on this issue. But I think it starts here. I think it started. You go back and parse his statements, and I think you'll see that President Obama has actually referred to this in very indirect ways a number of times. It's obviously somewhere up there in his thinking.
We have a question from our online audience I'm going to put forward to you, and then we'll come up here. Even if you're 100% correct on matters of public awareness about the Palestinian condition, why do you believe the American public cares about undoing the oppression? Would it make more sense to advance a pro-Palestinian lobby in the U.S. And filter rich Arab, Muslim, and European monies into the bank accounts of politicians who can affect the outcome of U.S. policy in the Middle East?
I think that's an interesting question. The Supreme Court, God bless them, have given sanction to all kinds of money flowing into politics. But as the very early years of AIPAC in the 50s showed, you don't set up a successful lobby by channeling money from abroad into anything. That's not the way to start. Anybody who does that will fail and will probably be prosecuted and deserves to be, A, because they broke the laws, but B, because they're stupid. That's just not the way to go about it. With all due respect to the questioner, who I don't see or know. You can't do that. That's just not the way to proceed. You build up a grassroots organization. You do the work in this country, and there are ways and ways to do it. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm an academic. I can tell you what has happened to some extent, and I'd argue maybe this is why. And if you are interested, you should study the growth of any major lobby, AARP, NRA, AIPAC. There's a bunch of them that are successful and powerful and throw their weight around almost without resistance in some cases. And there's a method to it, and it's one element, but it's not the only element. So far, I don't think that's the strength of this cause so far. The strength of this cause so far is reaching out to public opinion and beginning to break down this citadel of distortion and lies that has hidden the reality. Now, where that takes us, I don't know. That's the kind of thing that I can see happening. That's the kind of thing that I think there's a lot of work to be done on as far as how you change the political process. I think we're a long way away from doing that. One thing I will say is if you look at the history of how American communities, ethnic communities, come to have political power, it takes at least a generation or two for them to be settled and assimilated. I mean, you can't have people who don't speak English. You can't have people who didn't go to school here, and you can't don't speak English without an accent. And you can't have people who don't know the Constitution and don't have children who went to law school and have political power in this country. Doesn't happen. Didn't happen to the Irish. It didn't happen to the African Americans. It didn't happen to the migration from the South, which was their emigration from a condition of chattel living on plantations where their grandparents had been slaves and where they had no vote to the cities. I mean, it took 2 or 3 generations for people to speak standard English and for people's kids to go to law school and understand that you have rights and you have an ability to fight for it. Look at the weakness of the American Jewish community in the 30s and the 40s. The worst threat in the history of the Jewish people since Titus was rampant in Europe. And this community had absolutely no influence to change American policy one iota as far as immigration, as far as getting the United States into the war. No influence whatsoever. If Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, and if Hitler had not stupidly declared war on the United States 2 days later, we might not even have gotten into the European war. That was how absolutely helpless the American Jewish community was on an issue of enormous existential importance to it. Now, look at how this has changed for any community. You look at the American Jewish community, the Irish community. I mean, what city in the United States hasn't had an Irish mayor? I lived in Chicago under Mayor Daley for not quite 15 years. 100 years ago, the Irish and the Italians were brutally discriminated against in this country, and it took a long time before they learned how to use the levers of power. You can go to Paterson, New Jersey, or you can go to Dearborn, Michigan, and you will see communities that are essentially still ghettos, where people can live their entire lives without speaking any language other than Arabic. Well, as that changes, as people move out of those communities into the suburbs and become assimilated and integrated and send their kids to law school, that's what it's all about in American politics. Business, law, medicine, all of those wonderful things. I have one daughter who actually did it. Those are the levers of power, and those are the means in which you fight discrimination, and those are the means in which you understand how the system works and what your rights are and how you organize and how you can eventually develop the ability to have political power. That's going to happen, but those are processes that take time.
Yeah, hi, Rashid. Yeah, I am an Italian American. Went to law school, first one in my family, and it works. But seriously, I do agree. I think with your implied assertion that the battleground's really here. It's for the hearts and minds of the American people. And I've been working on this issue with many people who know me here for about 20 years, trying to organize community here. But I've been watching polls around the United States. And in one way, I've been very heartened by a recent poll by Zogby, which went contrary to what a lot of the other polls showed. As you know, great majorities of Americans were very pro-Israeli,
right,
and very tiny percentages are pro-Palestinian, like in the teens at best. However, a recent Zogby poll in the spring, I don't know if you saw it or not, asked an interesting question, and the question was, what do you think the Obama administration position should be vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine, or supporting both? 50% said both, only 6% said Palestine, and 34%, which sounds high but a lot lower than what it used to be, said Israel. So given that, assuming it's true, what does that tell you about maybe what the political movement in this country should be to support, quote-unquote, both, and quit demonizing both sides and really try to be, obviously, without sweeping things under the rug? I totally agree with you. You've got to do it. You got to go with the facts. And I know all about the Israeli new historians and so on. They were wonderful. But to try to do both, recognizing that center is not really well organized in this country, and it needs to be. Yeah.
I mean, this is a very tough question for me to answer, because this involves the nitty-gritty of political organizing and lobbying, which is not something I can tell you about. There are probably 80 people in this room who have spent their lives doing this, which is not something I've ever done. So all I'll say is that you have to start from a nucleus. You have to start from a base if you want to do something political. And I'm not sure that base yet fully exists. And I'm not talking only about an Arab-American base. If you read the Israeli press and you read some of these forums that take place in Israel about the most serious threats to Israel, they talk about stuff like, Facebook as a major existential threat to Israel. They talk about the highly organized activism on American campuses. I have never seen any highly organized activism on American campuses, pro-Palestinian activism. I think you'd have to have a little bit more organization and a little bit more coherence on the one side before you can talk about something that involves the kinds of things you're talking about. To share, you have to be not in a position of equality, but a position where you actually represent something in terms of a movement, represent something in terms of a community. And I just don't think that the pro-Palestine advocacy community is anywhere near there yet. What has happened is that on its own, public opinion is changing. The media is not pro-Palestinian. It's actually largely pro-Israeli still, but the media is beginning to change. And the same thing is true in a number of other spheres, the churches, inside the Jewish community. There's a bunch of places where, in spite of the disorganization of the Arab Americans, and in spite of their imperfect integration thus far into this country, because most of them are still first and second generation, in spite of a number of things like the complete ineptitude of the Arab and Palestinian leaderships to put forward a clear argument that people can listen to in this country. In spite of all of this, some of these changes I'm talking about are taking place. I don't know when the kind of thing you're talking about will be possible. I don't know, but I'm a historian by training, and I say in this, usually I say in answer to the kind of question you asked me in a couple, the job description of a historian does not include predicting the future. I don't know is the real answer to your question. No.
We went a little bit over time. I hope you'll join me in thanking Professor Khalidi for his time today.